Morning, church. My name is Laura Lineberry. I am one of the trustees that serves here at Aspire Church. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk to you about this insert that's in your worship guide. So if you want to pull that out and just take a look at it, it will tell you what are the requirements to serve as a trustee here, and on the backside to serve as a deacon. So this is the time of year for you to begin prayerfully considering who it is within your circle of influence that you feel would be qualified and gifted to serve as either deacon or trustee. And I've had the privilege to serve as both, and I count it just a real joy to be able to serve the church in this way. So I would ask you to think about who you would nominate, and then if you are nominated, I would ask you to prayerfully consider the privilege, the honor, to accept the nomination to serve as either a trustee or a deacon. So you don't have to turn it in today. Obviously, we want you to pray about it, but you can submit it online also, or you can fill out this form, the detachable part at the bottom. And now I want to read for us Psalm 27. I'm going to be reading from the ESV. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I see after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger, O you who have been my help. Cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. We pray with.
Morning. Good to see all of you here this morning. Welcome to Aspire Church San Marco. I'm Gary, and if I haven't had a chance to meet you before, I hope to get to meet you after the service. We are taking a few weeks during the summer to look at some Psalms, and we do this from time to time. We'll pick a theme out of the Psalms and try to explore that in the Psalms. And the theme, you could probably already tell from our worship this morning, is the beauty of the Lord. We're looking at ideas of God's beauty as it's captured in the Psalms. And you know, beauty is one of those things that you never quite get enough of, do you? I mean, you've never seen such a beautiful sunrise that you've never wanted to see another sunrise. You've never seen such beautiful art or architecture that you've never wanted to see more. Beauty is something we can never actually get enough of. And if you've ever noticed somebody who is an artist or somebody who is a creator, they are never fully satisfied with the thing of beauty that they've made. Like they see the flaws in it. I'm not an artist by any means, but I do occasionally paint a room in my house. And if any of you have ever done this, you know, if you're the one painting the room, you notice how you see every flaw? Like when you finish painting, you might go back and you see every little bubble, every spot where it's a little too thin. You can notice every single flaw. Somebody else might not notice it, unless they're your wife. They definitely will notice it, men. But somebody else might not notice it. But no matter what you are doing, that's as close as I get to art, to visual art, is painting a room. But I can imagine if I were a visual artist painting a picture, I would feel the same way, that no matter how great I think it was, there's always this thought, maybe I could do just a little bit better. not just visual art, but I'm sure singers and actors and people who create buildings and do all kinds of things. We always think, well, we could have done it just a little bit better. We never fully get to the level of beauty or perfection that we think is possible. Have you ever wondered about that? Have you ever thought, why is that? What is it that keeps us driving towards this idea of perfection or beauty that we can never fully attain? And the reality is that even when we create beautiful things, they don't often stay beautiful, do they? I mean, they fade with time. I mean, think about this. Think just about what you thought was trendy and stylish 25 years ago. And you look at pictures today and you're like, what was I thinking, right? What was I thinking, or what were they thinking if they were dressing me 25 years ago? But the idea of beauty, it shifts with time. And we don't always know what is beautiful at any given season. And then there's the reality that with the beauty in our world, there is always a little bit of ugliness mixed in. Have you noticed this too? I'll give you some examples. I was thinking about, any of you who have been world travelers or have gone to some of the most beautiful places on earth, it's always interesting to me that in the shadows of some of the most beautiful places on earth lies some of the greatest ugliness of the human condition. So for example, this is a picture of Madagascar. Madagascar is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. But this picture is also Madagascar. This, right? Now, here's what we do. Like if you're going to travel, unless you're going on a mission trip, you're not going to see the second picture. You're going to only see places that look like the first. Or think about this. This is the Ganges River, one of the most beautiful rivers in the world. But if you zoom in closer and you look at what's going on down in the villages, this is what you see when you get close enough. Or a little closer to home. How many of you have enjoyed driving through the Appalachian Mountains? Beautiful, beautiful mountains. Absolutely gorgeous in the fall with the colors, vibrant. But in Appalachia are some of the poorest people who live in the United States. And so you can find incredible poverty within those mountains. Or the city of Los Angeles, the city of angels, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But when you get close enough, what you find is there's tremendous poverty and brokenness in the city. So everywhere on the planet where there is beauty, there is also ugliness and there's brokenness. And this isn't just true of the art that we create, and it isn't just true of landscapes or places that we go to travel. It's also true in our life, isn't it? I mean, think about this. Think about the beauty of a wedding, the beautiful idea of marriage. And yet, in every marriage, even the healthiest, there are those ugly times, right? There are those times where you don't get along. You can't see eye to eye. It's tough. Or parenting. Nothing more beautiful than a brand new baby, the whole idea of new life. And then they become teenagers. Right? Or this idea that God's called you to a vocation, He's called you to work, and you feel called to this beautiful job, this beautiful task, and you enjoy it. But you know within the task itself, there's all kinds of difficult things that you have to do. Life can be beautiful, but life is also tough. Life is also difficult. It's mixture of beauty and ugliness, and we live in the middle of this. And Psalm 27 really reflects the tension that you see between the beauty of the Lord and the ugliness of the world in which we live. Now, here's what happens with us, and at least this is true for me. Many times what we will do is we will err on one of two sides when we live in the tension between the beauty and the ugliness. On the one hand, we will try to ignore the ugliness, right? We don't want to see the pictures of poverty. We only want to see the beautiful parts of the city. We only want to see the beautiful parts of the mountains. We don't want to go internationally and see the poverty. We just want to see the great landmarks that we can find. So we avoid all the ugly places. And even in our lives, we might just try to say, well, praise the Lord, right? Everything's great. And we keep our smile on as if everything is fine when it's not really fine. We try to ignore the ugliness. Or on the other hand, we give in to the despair. And we wallow in the ugliness of life, and we see all the brokenness and the pain and the hurt, and we think it'll never get better than this, and we give into the despair. And what Psalm 27 does, which is so amazing, is it doesn't do either of those things. It recognizes the reality of the ugliness, but it calls us to a hope for what is beautiful and how God is ultimately going to transform the ugliness of this world into the kind of beauty that endures and lasts, and that finally and fully gives us a picture of the God that we worship. So let's take a look at Psalm 27. If you have a Bible, look with me back at Psalm 27. The first thing we see in Psalm 27 is the ugliness of the world. Look at the first few verses. He talks about the day of trouble. Anybody had a day of trouble this week? I know I have, right? I mean, it seems like if you've got 7 days, you're going to at least have one day of trouble in those 7 days, probably a few more for some of us, right? The day of trouble comes. This is the ugliness of the world. So what does he say? Verse 2, evildoers assail me and eat my flesh. That's pretty ugly. He says in verse 3, people are at war with me. Verse 12, false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. Verse 10, my mother and my father have betrayed me. See, it's the gamut of human suffering that we see here, isn't it? I mean, we see all of it. And the psalmist doesn't avoid it. He says, this is life. This is the world in which we live. The American cultural anthropologist Ernest Beck said this one time. He said, I think that taking life seriously means something such as this, that whatever man does on this planet has to be done in the lived truth of the terror of creation, of the grotesque, of the rumble of panic underneath everything. Otherwise, it is all false. The rumble of panic beneath everything. Have you felt that? You watch the news, do you feel the rumble of panic beneath everything? That there's just a sense that right beneath the surface of all that is beautiful, of all that is good, that just right beneath the surface of that, there is something ugly, there's something sinister. And what Ernest Beck says is that this rumble of panic, this reality of the ugliness and the brokenness of the world has got to be part of what we realize and recognize, that this is part of the fallenness and the brokenness. And here's the thing, the psalmist, as he's writing Psalm 27, the psalmist is not practicing religious escapism, which is so often what we are tempted to practice. Let's just hide ourselves inside the sanctuary, behind the stained glass windows, and play the pipe organ louder and pretend like everything is okay. That is not what the psalmist does. The psalmist says, in fact, that we need to recognize these things are real. The ugliness is real. So what does he do? He faces his trouble with his head lifted up. Look what he says in verse 6. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. My head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. In verses 1 through 3, as he's talking about the ugliness of the world, what does he say? He says, God is the light in darkness and a stronghold in a time of fear. He doesn't say that there is no darkness, and he doesn't say that there's nothing to fear, but he says in the middle of that, lift up your head and realize that there is a light that shines in the darkness. There's a stronghold in the time of fear. See, God doesn't promise the absence of enemies. He promises to be a stronghold in their presence. God does not promise you that you will not endure the darkness of night and despair. He promises you that he will be a light for you in the midst of it. Psalm 23, that famous psalm that we've looked at before, says he prepares a table before me where? In the presence of what? In the presence of my enemies. Think about that. Think about that. That God is not saying there is not ugliness, there are not enemies, there is not war, there is not violence. God is saying, I will meet you in the middle of it. I will come to you in the middle while you are surrounded by your enemies, and I will make a banquet before you in their presence. This is the God who loves us and pursues us. Let me ask you, what enemies are surrounding you right now? Are you overwhelmed with the ugliness of the world? Maybe you are facing some very ugly challenges right now with relationships or finances or with your job, or you're just overwhelmed by the challenges of the world and society that are around us. Join the psalmist in saying, don't ignore it, but lift up your head. Lift up your head and see past it to the God who is calling you to himself. So how do we do this? How do we do this? What is it that we're to focus on? How do we find the beauty of God in the ugliness of the world. Well, that's the second thing he talks about, as he talks about the beauty of the Lord. See, the ugliness of the world is real, but so is the beauty of the Lord. Look what he says in verse 4. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and gaze upon the beauty of the Lord to inquire of his temple. This is the beauty of the Lord. That he's saying, one thing I ask, in the middle of all these challenges, in the middle of all the brokenness, in the middle of the darkness, in the middle of my enemies, in the middle of all of this, the one thing that I want to do is I want to seek the presence of the Lord, that I may dwell in his house and that I may gaze upon his beauty. He's not talking about a passing glance. You know, there's a lot of people that you give passing glances to. When you're in the store, for example, if you're walking around in your favorite grocery store, you're walking down the aisle and you see the people around you, right? You give a passing glance to them so that you don't run into them. You might notice them. You might notice something about them, but you don't gaze at them because that'd be a little awkward, wouldn't it? I mean, maybe for some of you it might be how you find a date, but I'm just saying, typically when we're walking through the stores, we're walking through life, we don't gaze upon people, we glance at them. But listen, far too often, that's exactly what we do when it comes to our relationship with the Lord. We just glance at him. We read a verse of the day. We might go a day or two without praying, or maybe we just pray before a meal, or we throw up a God help me prayer in the middle of the day, which is great. He loves to hear from you. He loves a passing glance. But that's not what Psalm 27 is talking about. Psalm 27 is talking about a gaze, to gaze upon the Lord. It's not a one-time glimpse, but it's a steady, sustained focus. Let me ask you this. What do you look at? What do you gaze upon? Where is your focus today? You know, when we talk about our perception, our ability to perceive something, you have the ability with your eyesight and your hearing and your senses as you're walking around, you perceive things, you feel things. You ever had anybody walk up behind you and you couldn't see them, but you kind of felt that they were there? Like there's all kinds of things about us that we perceive. We have perception, right? Perception is useful. We need it. We need to perceive things. We can recognize an enemy, or we can recognize a friend, or we can avoid running into someone. But perception can also be pleasurable. Perception can also be something that we enjoy, right? When you go to see art, or you look at a beautiful landscape, or you go to hear a symphony, you are perceiving things, but you're not doing it for your own protection. You're not doing it just for your own convenience. You're doing it because you are enjoying the beauty of it. I don't know how many of you, if you were in school, high school or college, you were required to take some sort of art or music appreciation class. For some, maybe you took that class because you just had to take it in order to get your degree to get out of school, right? So you go and you take this music appreciation class, and they play all these great musical composers, and you don't really care about that, right? You just listen to it, you just pass the test so you can get your credit, so you can you are perceiving the music, but you are doing it for a useful purpose. But then there are people who pay good money to go to the symphony and perceive the music. And it's very different, isn't it? It's very different. One is useful. One is about the beauty. See, you can perceive the Lord for useful purposes. God help me. God deliver me. God bless me. Or you can gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and you can perceive the goodness and the majesty of the Lord. Is your perception of God merely useful, or is it pleasurable? Jonathan Edwards, the great preacher, says that the difference between a real Christian and a religious person is that a religious person finds God useful, but a real Christian finds God beautiful. Let me ask you, do you perceive that God is beautiful? Look what he said in Psalm 27, verse 8. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, I seek. Are you seeking the face of the Lord in the midst of the ugliness, of the brokenness, of the despair? Have you given into it? Have you recognized that in the middle of all of it, God is inviting you to lift your head above your circumstances, above your enemies, and to gaze, not to glance, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to perceive his beauty, not just to perceive him as a useful ends to a means. See, the ugliness of the world is real, but so is the beauty of the Lord. And even more powerful is what this psalm says about the coming transformation. See, because there is coming a transformation. This is the hope that we have. Even if you're here today and you're not a believer, you don't know what you believe about God, you don't know if you believe about Jesus, every single human aspires towards something better than the world in which we live today. Whether they think they can do it through politics or they think they can do it through economics or social help, whatever it is, we all aspire to something better. But the only way that the ugliness of the world can ever be transformed and recreated is through the beauty of the Lord and the transformation that he offers. How is the world's ugliness made beautiful again? Well, you've got to go to the temple, Psalm 27 says. David points to this temple, this place, God's dwelling place, where God lives, the tabernacle. Look what he says again, back verse 4 and 5. Again, one thing I ask of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell where? In the house of the Lord all the days of my life. To gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire where? In his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. See, I know it's popular for people to say that you can find the beauty of God anywhere, but the Bible doesn't really say that. If you search in the Bible doesn't say that you can find the beauty of God just anywhere. The Bible consistently says that you will see God's ultimate beauty in his dwelling place, in his temple, in his tabernacle, in the place of worship and in the place of sacrifice. In the Old Testament, if you followed the story of the nation of Israel when they were enslaved and God sent Moses to deliver them out into the desert. And we see for the first time this Shekinah glory of the Lord, the presence, the manifest presence of God as he's leading the children of Israel through the desert. And it's a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. And they see this majestic, glorious presence of the Lord guiding them through this desert. A hard place, a dry place, a place of famine, a place of despair, a place of death. But what are they constantly doing? They're constantly lifting their heads to see the glory of the Lord. And the Lord is leading them through the desert. Well, what happens? Well, eventually what they do is they build a tabernacle. They build this tent, literally a tent that they build. And you can, if you ever tried to read through the Bible and you got to those parts of the Bible where they're describing this tent and these buildings, and it goes on and on and on and on and on, and then pretty soon you realize you're not reading through the Bible anymore because you got stuck. Well, what are they talking about? They're talking about these places where the presence, the glory of the Lord was supposed to dwell. And when the Israelites, when the people of God wanted to meet with God, they went to this tabernacle, and later on it would be the temple that they would build. And the idea here was that this was the place, this was the geographic location where heaven would meet earth, right? That all the glories of heaven would just kiss the very surface of earth at one spot, and that's where God's presence would be. It was similar to the idea that with time, God is outside of time, but the idea of the Sabbath is that there is one day during the week where God's time and man's time cross over. It's the Sabbath, the day of rest. And so the temple was that place where the presence of the Lord was to dwell. And what is David saying? He's saying, one thing I seek, that I will go to the house of the Lord and that I can live there forever. But that's not realistic, is it? I mean, we can't come here and live here forever. We can't stay in this building all the days of our life. And we probably ultimately wouldn't want to, would we? There's so much about the rest of the world we'd miss. There's so many beautiful things we wouldn't see. There's so much that we wouldn't be able to do if we simply dwelled in the house of the Lord forever. But see, there was something that happened because the temple would ultimately be destroyed. This temple that was made by the hands of men, they would carve the stones and they would stack them up. This place was a temporary dwelling. There was another plan that was to come. And so in John chapter 4, what do you see? In John chapter 4, you see Jesus coming, and he's encountering this woman who lives in Samaria. She's a Samaritan. Jesus is a Jew. And so he encounters this woman and he asks her for a drink from the well. And they get into this theological debate about where do you go to see the beauty of the Lord? Where do you go to worship him? Because the Samaritans say, well, we worship on this hill. But the Jews say, no, you can't see the beauty of the Lord just anywhere you want. You have to go to the temple in Jerusalem. That's where you go to worship and to find the beauty of the Lord. You go to the temple. That's where it is. And so this woman says, hey, you Jews say you can only see the beauty of the Lord in the temple, but we Samaritans say you can worship the Lord on this holy hill, on this hill in Samaria. So which is it? And Jesus responds to her, says, there's coming a day where it won't be either of those. But those who worship the beauty of the Lord will worship him in spirit and in truth. Now we have to back up. Because who is this that would say that? Who is this person that would undo centuries and millennia of tradition where everybody could just go to the temple to worship the Lord? And Jesus is saying suddenly that's not true anymore. In fact, later on, the Pharisees and the Sadducees would ask him about the temple, and he would say, you could tear that whole thing down, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. You see, this wasn't just any ordinary man, any ordinary prophet. Because in John chapter 1, what we see is that John talks about Jesus coming into the world, and he says the Word, God, became flesh. And literally, he pitched his tent among us. You see, that Jesus is the dwelling place of God. That it is in Jesus that we see all the beauty and the majesty of the Lord. It is Jesus who, through his death on the cross, instigated the veil of the temple being torn in two, and suddenly the beauty of the Lord is no longer confined to this building that was simply built by people, but the beauty of the Lord is now out of the box. And so the glory of the Lord would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. This is our God. Philippians 2 says that Jesus, even though he was God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he laid aside his rights as God, and he came to earth that we might see and understand the beauty of the Lord. And it is the beauty of the Lord that comes to transform us. And how does he do this? Isaiah 53, hundreds of years before Jesus was born, Isaiah is describing the coming of this one, this Messiah. And he said this about him, that he had no beauty or no majesty that we could see, and that many people were appalled by him. Think about the ugliness of the cross. The majesty and glory of heaven. And Jesus sets it aside to enter into the ugliness of our world. That he who was beautiful became ugly, so that you, who are ugly, could be made beautiful. His beauty is transferred to us. See, all the beauty that we have on this earth is fleeting. The Garden of Eden, we were cast out of it. You think you plant a beautiful garden in your yard and the flowers fade. Death comes our way. Beauty passes away. But his beauty, the beauty of God, is transferred to us through Jesus. And the ugliness of our sin died with him on the cross. See, what does the psalmist say at the end? He says, I will look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. How do we see the goodness and beauty of God in the land of the living with so much ugliness around us? We lift up our heads. We don't ignore the ugliness, but we lift up our heads and we look upon the face of Jesus, the beauty of God. And through his sacrifice, through his willingness to enter into the ugliness of our world, we can be made beautiful again. See, you don't have to worry about not being beautiful enough. You don't have to worry about not being smart enough, strong enough. Because the more you gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, the more you are satisfied with him, and the more his beauty rests upon you. Listen, I don't know what your day of trouble has been this week, or will be next week, or maybe today. I don't know what ugliness you are facing right now. I don't know what challenges are coming your way, and they seem overwhelming. Maybe with a health situation. Maybe you're facing an ugly situation at work or with your children or with family members. But I do know this. I do know that as painful and as real and as challenging as that is, the beauty of the Lord is greater. And the power of Christ to transform the ugliness of your situation is real. But what we have to do is we have to be willing to lift our heads and keep our gaze on Jesus. One of my very favorite hymns is "Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus." It says, "Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this world will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace." I love that. I love it because it's true. I love it because I've experienced it. It's not that the ugly things still aren't there. It's that in comparison to the beauty of the Lord, they're put in their proper perspective. And the hope of this life is that I will not be consumed by the ugliness, but I will gaze upon the beauty of the Lord in the land of the living. I'm going to invite you to bow and pray with me as our musicians come back. Maybe today you are facing a challenge. You're facing the ugliness of this world and you are a little overwhelmed. Maybe you just need somebody to pray for you. We would be honored to do that. You just need someone to encourage you to lift up your head. Maybe today, coming into this place that we call the house of the Lord, not meaning it in the same way as the temple, but coming here, you've been able to gaze upon, refocus on Jesus and his beauty, and that will give you what you need to go through the ugliness of this week. Whatever it is that God is doing in your life today, I just invite you to take this time to gaze upon the beauty of our Lord.